Okay, so in the last video, we looked at the idea of initiating the sending of an email via Microsoft Access. Most of the fields in that email, to field, subject, body of the email, was all constants. They were all strings that we hard-coded into the VB script. And then at the end, we showed you a little bit of dynamic information, how to append date into the subject, that maybe this is timely information, and particularly if someone keeps their emails in an archive, they want to be able to find the specific date that they're looking for. This is the report for such and such date. So we're going to keep building on that idea. So in this video, we're going to look at how to remove the constant, the hard-coded value for the recipient, and how to put a field from a table in there. So we're going to put a field from a table as the recipient. And this way, say you have like 10 different reports that have to go to different people, and for some reason it's not automated, you can basically select the recipient and then select what report they're going to receive, that type of thing. Okay. So if the table is already open, you can click on the tab for table. If it's not, you can just double click here, or if for some reason you don't have the default table that gets created when you open a new database, you can just click on create, and table does the same thing. It creates a table with a single field called ID, its auto number, and it is a primary key. So at any rate, you need the table selected. Click on home, view, design view. Wants you to save it. Let's call this employee underscore active, because you probably shouldn't just have an employee table. You should have employee active, employee terminated, because you still might have to keep historical data of that, whether legal or whatever. You might have to store terminated employee information as well. Maybe you want a separate table for contractors. So I don't want to go too much into that discussion, but just a quick reminder that try to be descriptive when you're naming tables, when you're naming fields, because often when this data is taken out of context, you want it to be meaningful to whoever it goes to. So we'll click on OK. So here's what we're saying. You have a single field that's auto number, and it's a primary key. I'm not going to get into discussion about primary keys. People have mentioned a few times, why do you delete the primary key, or why do you at least not have a primary key? It's a legitimate discussion, but it's really separate from what we're trying to do here. I try to focus just on a certain functionality. I will eventually do a video on primary keys, but now is not the time. So having said that, I'm going to do what I normally do. Unclick primary key, and we're going to change this data type. So it's going to be a short text, and we'll call this employee underscore, and let's call it work underscore address for our email address. And again, because someone might have a home email address that you contact them at, that address might be used for continuance of operations. Because if the person can't get to work, you're not going to try to contact them via their work email. You'd contact via their personal email. Just like if you have to call someone for continuance of operations, disaster recovery as it used to be called, you probably wouldn't call their work phone number, you'd call their home phone number. So just trying to reiterate that you want this to be descriptive and meaning, even if it's taken out of context of the database. Okay, so we have an employee underscore work underscore address, a little bit wordy, but I've seen worse, and it's short text. So we've established a field and a data type. Now we actually have to populate that. So let's click on View. We get the pop-up saying we must save it. Yes. And because the name is so long, I'm going to widen this table. So if you point at the separator, left-click, drag, it widens the table. Yes, you can just double-click on that as well, too. Okay, so now when you're in Datasheet view, this is where you're actually putting values into the table. So you're not changing the structure of the table. Okay, you're not adding new fields to the table, you're adding new rows to the table. So as soon as you put in a value, you've made the change. So I would need to save it because I changed the width, but I don't need to save it when I enter a value because you're not changing the structure there. So we'll call this fake email, because I don't want to accidentally email someone in the demo, and we'll say no underscore ISP dot Reva. And then we'll call this another email at no ISP and we'll call this one more. If I could type, at no ISP. So obviously it looks wonky because this isn't real data, but keep in mind that if you're going to be using this as an email, no extra character spaces, it actually has to be the functional email address, the domain, so on and so forth. Okay, so now we have some data. It's not a lot. And what we'll do is we'll close this. Again, it wants me to save it because I widened this, not because I added values. And I know I've said that before, but it's just very important. Once you add a value to your database, that's it. The value is there. Particularly if you're overwriting another value. You don't have a way to recover it necessarily. Okay, so what we're going to do is this form, we're going to click on View, and we'll click on Design. Dots up here to remind you that it's the form that you're going to be looking at the property of. We never associated this form with the table. We didn't need to because the last one was very introductory. Now we're going to be wanting to point to this table. We're going to want values from this table. Okay, so what we're going to do is we want to click on Format, and sorry, we're going to click on Data. My apologies, not Format. We're going to click on Data, Record Source, and there's the table, Employee Active. So now we can access fields from that table on this form. So why do we want to do that? It gets back to what I was saying about how we want to have, we don't want to hard code a person's email address into the VB script. We want to use a field from a table. So now we're really close to being able to get that field from the table into that line of code. So what do we want to do? So now that this form is aware, shall we say, of the table, what we can do is let's choose a combo box. These things are great, aren't they? And what we want is, we can leave it as that. I want the combo box to get values from another table or query. And then we'll do next. And it's employee active. Next. Selected field. Next. And next. And here's the thing. When you widen this, this will actually impact how wide you'll see in here. So even if you make this selector wider, if it's not wide enough here, it would still be cut off. So next. Remember the values for later use. Next. Finish. Now, if you grab the dot in the upper left corner, you can move these independently, whereas if you grab a border, they both move. Just undo that. And not going to be too worried about the way this looks visually. Again, this isn't about layout, this is about functionality. So, what we're going to do now is we save this. We go back to View. And now we can see those email addresses. So we're now very, very close to where we want to be. So click on View, click on Design, And before we click on command, just make a note of what this object is. This object is combo 1. We're going to need to reference that. So click on command, and here's on click our event procedure. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're using the same command. We just need to change this. Again, rather than being a constant, rather than being a string, we're going to change this into a command. So what we're going to do, we're going to say me, because again, we're going to reference combo 1, which is now on the form that this script is attached to. Or to be more precise, it's attached to an object that's on that form. So me dot combo 1, and the value that's selected. No quotes, because this, when you do quotes, you're saying, I want this actual value. Here, it's more of a calculation. You're saying, return this value and put it here. So make sure you're not putting quotes there. You save it, close it. Could keep it open, whatever. Save it. I just find Access, it might be user error on my part, but I find Access is a little bit wonky, where sometimes things don't seem to necessarily save if they're open. Could be, like I said, could be user error, but I try to make sure I close things out, if nothing else, because it'll give you a warning that something wasn't saved. Again, try to remove that user error part of it. Okay, so we now modify this. So the event procedure now, rather than trying to send it to the same person, the same recipient, having it hard-coded, it's now looking to a value from here. So save it again, just make sure, click on View, and you can choose whichever one you want. You could choose fake email. Let's choose the middle one, another email. Our send button, click on this. And there you go. Just like that, you've removed the hard coding of a specific email address, and instead you've said bring in the value from that field. So let's close this. We'll get our error message since we didn't save it. So what happens now is if you want to change the recipient, you don't have to go into the underlying modules. You don't have to go into the underlying event procedures. As long as this table is accessible, okay, and maybe you're going to have a form that lets you modify this table, this will auto-update. This is linked to this. So if you remove if you move a value from here, if you remove a row from here, okay, it will no longer show up here. If you add one here, it'll show up here. And that's basically how it works. So now you don't have to do this kind of manual, well, you're still doing a manual changing of this table, but at least this table cascades into here. And presumably, if this is your so-called mission-critical database, if this is your actual production database, this would also cascade into other places. So any form, any combo box, any whatever that's utilizing data from this table would be updated. So again, you don't have to manually change the values that this form is accessing because it's linked to a table, and those changes to that table, the values in that table would cascade out to anything that's accessing that table. Okay, so I think that's it for this video. So now we've looked at, let's go back to View, Design, go to our Command button, go to our Event Procedure. So now we have a date in the subject, letting people know what date it's relevant to if you care. Now you have this being sent to them. So next we're going to look at building out that table, so as or possibly a separate reports table to modify this based on what you're sending them, and modify. Right now we're not sending an object. We could send an object, which we'll eventually look at. We'll have to make a separate table That way we have something to actually query, something to actually send somebody. Okay, so I think that should about do it for this video. I hope you found it helpful.